The moment someone tears down a fence they don't own, they stop being a neighbor and start becoming a problem. The sound hit me before I even made it to the porch. A deep metallic groan followed by the crack of old cedar splitting under pressure. I was halfway through my first cup of coffee when the noise rolled across the pasture. The smell of fresh cut wood drifted through the open kitchen window, sharp and wrong. My stomach tightened immediately. Out on a ranch, you learn to recognize sounds the way sailors recognize storms. And that sound didn't belong on my property. I stepped outside and felt the cool Texas morning air against my face. The sun had barely cleared the horizon, painting long shadows across the grass. Then I saw it. A yellow excavator sat where my fence line should have been. Its hydraulic arm lifted another section of cedar posts from the ground like they weighed nothing. Splinters littered the dirt. Dust hung in the air. Nearly 200 feet of fencing had already been ripped out before I even knew what was happening. I crossed the yard fast, boots crunching over gravel. Every step brought a clearer view of the damage. The old fence wasn't just a fence. My grandfather had built it in 1968 with his own hands. Every post had been set by hand. Every rail measured twice before being nailed into place. He used to tell me that a good fence lasted longer than arguments and protected more than property. Looking at the broken posts scattered across the pasture felt like looking at pieces of family history tossed into a dumpster. The excavator operator noticed me approaching and shut down the engine. The sudden silence felt almost louder than the machine. A construction worker in a reflective vest walked toward me holding a clipboard. He looked uncomfortable before he even opened his mouth. "Morning, sir," he said. "We've got authorization." I stared at him. Authorization from who? He pointed toward a brand new sign planted near the road. White lettering. Decorative trim. Fresh paint. The words made my jaw tighten. Willow Creek Community Nature Trail. "The HOA," he answered. "They said this section belongs to the community now." Belongs to the community now. Those 5 words hung in the air like smoke. I looked beyond the destroyed fence and noticed a line of survey flags stretching across my pasture. Bright orange markers cut straight through grazing land that had belonged to my family for 3 generations. Somebody hadn't just removed a fence. Somebody had decided they could redraw reality. In the distance, I could hear the low rumble of my longhorn bulls moving across the far field. 18 massive animals grazing peacefully behind the remaining sections of fencing. The same fencing now missing a critical stretch. The workers shifted nervously. "We're supposed to have the walking path finished by Saturday." I looked from the broken posts to the survey flags and then back toward my pasture. Something told me this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was the opening move. And whoever made it had absolutely no idea what kind of trouble they had just walked into. I stood there for a long moment after the workers left, listening to the wind move through the pasture. The smell of diesel still lingered in the air where the excavator had been parked. Across the field, one of my longhorns lifted his head and stared toward the damaged fence line as if even he knew something was wrong. "My name is Ethan Walker. I am 47 years old, and every acre of that ranch carries a piece of my family in it. My grandfather bought the original 40 acres after returning home from military service in the late 1960s. Back then there were no subdivisions, no homeowners associations, and no people holding meetings about community aesthetics. There was open land, hard work, and enough sky to make a man feel small. Over the decades, my family expanded the property 1 parcel at a time until it reached 140 acres. Every fence post, every water trough, every cattle gate had a story attached to it. The old cedar fence they tore out that morning was more than a property line. I remembered helping my grandfather repair sections of it when I was 10 years old. I could still feel the rough grain of the wood under my hands and hear the metallic clink of his hammer striking staples into the rails. He always carried a thermos of black coffee that smelled like burnt oak and stubbornness. Whenever I complained about the heat, he would grin and tell me the same thing. "A fence does not keep cattle in. It keeps foolish people out." At the time, I thought it was just another ranch saying. Years later, I understood exactly what he meant. After my grandfather passed away, my father took over. Then when cancer took him 12 years ago, the ranch became mine. I never left. Some people chase office buildings and city skylines. I stayed where I belonged. My mornings started before sunrise. My boots collected dust instead of elevator rides. The sound of cattle moving through pasture grass became my version of rush hour traffic. And honestly, I would not trade it for anything. The Longhorn operation alone represented years of work. 18 breeding bulls, dozens of cows, veterinary records, bloodlines, feed schedules, inspections. People who live in subdivisions often look at cattle and see scenery. Ranchers see responsibility. Every animal under my care depended on fences, water access, grazing management, and predictable boundaries. That was why seeing those survey flags cut through my pasture bothered me more with every passing minute. Someone sitting behind a conference table had looked at generations of work and decided it was in used space. Around noon, I climbed into my truck and drove toward the newest section of Willow Creek Estates. The subdivision had expanded steadily during the last decade. Rows of nearly identical houses stretched across what used to be grazing land owned by neighboring ranches. Fresh mulch lined the sidewalks. Sprinklers clicked rhythmically across bright green lawns. Decorative flags fluttered from front porches. Everything looked polished, organized, and controlled. But what really caught my attention were the giant banners hanging near the sales office. Coming soon. New phase opening this summer. Luxury homes with nature access. Beneath the slogan was a large rendering of families walking along a scenic trail. I felt my jaw tighten when I recognized the landscape in the background. The artist had drawn my pasture, my fence, my pond, my land. They had already printed the advertisements. They had already started selling the dream. And for the first time that day, I realized the destroyed fence was not the actual problem. It was only the first symptom of a much larger plan. The next morning, I parked across from the Willow Creek Estates clubhouse and finally met the woman whose fingerprints seemed to be all over this mess. Patricia Holloway walked out of the building carrying a leather portfolio and a stainless steel coffee tumbler that probably cost more than my first truck payment. She was in her early 50s, perfectly styled, perfectly pressed, and perfectly convinced that the world existed to follow her instructions. Even from 50 yards away, I could see the confidence in the way she moved. She smiled constantly, but it was the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. The kind people use when they are selling something or hiding something. The clubhouse parking lot smelled like fresh mulch and new asphalt. Contractors were busy hanging banners for upcoming community events. Patricia stopped every few feet to inspect details and issue directions. Nobody questioned her. Nobody argued. They simply nodded and got back to work. Watching her for 10 minutes told me everything I needed to know. She did not see herself as a volunteer serving a neighborhood. She saw herself as the ruler of it. I introduced myself when she finally noticed me standing near the entrance. Her smile tightened for half a second before returning. "Mr. Walker," she said, "I was wondering when you would stop by." The fact that she expected me told me even more. She had not accidentally wandered onto my property. This had been planned. "I want to know why your contractors removed my fence," I said. She took a slow sip of coffee before answering. "The community board approved an improvement project that benefits local residents." "On my land?" I asked. "That question is more complicated than you think." There it was. Not an apology. Not confusion. Not even denial. Just confidence. The dangerous kind. Patricia motioned toward a large development map mounted inside the clubhouse lobby. I followed her in. Cool air from the building washed over me, carrying the scent of fresh paint and expensive furniture. The map covered an entire wall. Colored sections showed future expansion phases, walking trails, green spaces, playgrounds, and dozens of additional homes. My stomach sank as I studied it. A thick green line curved through the center of the design. It ran directly across my ranch. Patricia tapped the map with one manicured finger. Residents want outdoor amenities. Buyers expect connectivity. The future of this community depends on accessible recreational space. That is still my property. She shrugged lightly. Large, undeveloped areas often create opportunities for creative planning. Undeveloped. I almost laughed. Hundreds of head of cattle had grazed that land over 3 generations. Water systems, fencing, feed stations, veterinary access roads. Just because something did not look like a shopping center did not make it undeveloped. Patricia continued speaking as if she were explaining something obvious to a child. People moving here want scenic views and nature access. Property values rise when communities embrace progress. The word progress echoed in my head all the way back to my truck. By the time I reached the parking lot, I realized what made Patricia dangerous. She genuinely believed she was helping. In her mind, My ranch was not a working operation supporting livestock and preserving family history. It was empty space waiting to be improved. And people who believe they are improving something rarely recognize when they are crossing a line. As I started the engine, I noticed another banner being raised near the sales office. Families smiling. Children walking along a trail. A picture-perfect version of the future. The trail in the advertisement looked familiar because it followed the exact route where my fence used to stand. They were not hiding their plan anymore. They were advertising it. The walking path officially opened 3 days later. I knew because the first jogger showed up before sunrise. The rhythmic crunch of running shoes on gravel drifted across the pasture while I was checking water tanks near the south field. At first I thought somebody had wandered onto the property by mistake. Then another person appeared. Then another. By lunchtime, a steady stream of residents was moving through the gap where my fence used to stand. The smell of sunscreen, perfume, and freshly brewed coffee replaced the familiar scent of grass and livestock. People treated the trail like it had always been there. Some waved politely. Others never even looked up. A man pushing a stroller rolled right past one of my livestock warning signs without reading it. 2 teenagers stopped near a fence corner to take photographs. By the weekend, the traffic doubled. Then it doubled again. Every morning brought new surprises. Joggers, dog walkers, cyclists, parents with children, people carrying water bottles and fitness trackers. The path had become popular faster than I could have imagined. The problem was that nobody using it seemed to understand they were crossing an active ranch. One afternoon, I spotted a woman feeding grass to a young calf through a fence opening. Another visitor tossed pieces of bread onto the ground because he thought the cattle looked hungry. Someone else left a sports drink bottle beside a water trough. None of them meant harm. That was what made the situation so frustrating. Carelessness often causes more problems than malice. The sounds changed too. My ranch had always been quiet. Wind through cedar trees. Cattle moving through pasture. The occasional rumble of a tractor engine. Now I heard bicycle bells, portable speakers, barking dogs, and conversations floating across fields that had been peaceful for decades. Every day felt less like a working ranch and more like a public park. I spent hours documenting everything. Photographs, video clips, timestamps, vehicle license plates. Not because I wanted to fight, but because experience had taught me that people rarely believe a problem exists until you can prove it. Then came the drones. That was when my patience really started wearing thin. One afternoon, a buzzing sound circled above the pasture while I was repairing a gate. I looked up and saw a small drone hovering over a group of longhorns. The animals shifted uneasily while the device drifted lower for a better video angle. Whoever was controlling it stood somewhere on the walking path laughing with friends. To them, it was entertainment. To me, it was another example of people treating a working ranch like an attraction. The most frustrating part was Patricia's reaction. I called the Homeowners Association office several times during that first week. I sent photographs. I explained the issues. I asked for meetings. Every response sounded polished and professional while accomplishing absolutely nothing. Community engagement was increasing. Residents loved the new amenity. Property values were responding positively. Future expansion opportunities looked promising. Those were the phrases they kept repeating. Nobody wanted to discuss livestock operations, liability concerns, or property rights. Then one evening, just before sunset, I drove past the subdivision entrance and noticed a new banner hanging beside the sales office. Bright colors, smiling families, large lettering visible from the highway. Community walking festival coming soon. Live music, food vendors, family activities. I slowed the truck and stared at the sign. According to the advertisement, the event would take place along the trail running through my ranch. Hundreds of visitors were expected. I sat there listening to the engine idle while the orange glow of sunset reflected off the banner. For the first time since this started, I felt something shift. Patricia was no longer testing boundaries. She was accelerating, and the faster she pushed forward, the more evidence she left behind. 3 days after I saw the festival banner, the situation stopped being an annoyance and became personal. The morning started like every other. A pale sunrise stretched across the pasture. The smell of damp grass lingered in the cool air. I was checking feed stations near the east field when I noticed one of the younger calves standing alone near the damaged fence corridor. Something about the way she moved immediately caught my attention. Ranchers learn to spot trouble long before it becomes obvious. I walked closer, and felt my stomach sink. The calf was limping. Not badly, but enough to tell me something was wrong. I spent the next hour examining her and trying to figure out what had happened. Eventually, I found the answer lying near the walking trail. A broken retractable dog leash tangled in weeds beside a pile of litter. Judging by the tracks in the dirt, somebody's unleashed dog had chased cattle through part of the pasture. Nobody had reported it. Nobody had knocked on my door. They simply enjoyed their walk and went home while I dealt with the consequences. The anger that hit me was different from anything I had felt so far. Up until that moment, Patricia's project had mostly been an attack on property. Fences could be rebuilt. Signs could be removed. Survey stakes could be pulled from the ground. But livestock depended on stability. Every unnecessary disruption created risk. I stood there listening to the distant sounds of cyclists moving along the trail while the calf nervously shifted her weight. The contrast made my jaw tighten. To the people using that path, this was recreation. To me, it was my livelihood. That afternoon, I drove the perimeter and discovered even more problems. Somebody had left snack wrappers near a water trough. A section of temporary fencing had been bent by visitors climbing over it for photographs. Fresh bicycle tracks cut across a grazing zone clearly marked with warning signs. None of the damage was catastrophic by itself. The problem was volume. One careless act becomes 10. 10 becomes 50. Eventually, the entire operation starts paying the price. The next day brought another surprise. A local real estate magazine arrived in my mailbox. Patricia was featured on the cover. She stood smiling in front of a large photograph of Willow Creek Estates. The article praised her vision for transforming the community through innovative outdoor amenities. Halfway through the story, I found a rendering of the trail project. The caption described it as a unique community asset connecting residents to natural open spaces. Natural open spaces. That phrase appeared 3 separate times. Not once did the article mention a working ranch. Not once did it mention private property. Not once did it mention cattle. Reading it felt like watching somebody slowly erase my existence. With marketing language. Later that evening, I attended a homeowners association meeting. I sat quietly in the back while Patricia gave updates about future development plans. The room smelled like coffee and printer paper. Residents applauded every announcement. Then she revealed the final detail. The upcoming festival had expanded. Food trucks, live music, vendor booths, children's activities. Attendance projections exceeded 300 people. Applause filled the room again. Patricia looked pleased with herself. Then someone asked whether permission had been secured for the trail expansion. I watched her smile without hesitation. "Everything is moving forward exactly as planned," she said. The audience seemed satisfied. I was not, because she had answered a different question than the one asked. She never said she had permission. She only said things were moving forward. Driving home that night, I could still hear her words echoing in my head. Everything is moving forward exactly as planned. The stars were bright above the pasture when I pulled through the gate. Out in the darkness, the longhorns moved quietly across the field. Their silhouettes drifted through the moonlight behind the remaining fence lines. That was when I realized something important. Patricia believed momentum would protect her. She thought if she pushed fast enough, built enough support, printed enough advertisements, and attracted enough attention, nobody would stop to question whether she had the right to do any of it. What she did not understand was that every new event, every new banner, and every new visitor was creating a record, and records have a way of becoming evidence. The following week, I stopped reacting and started investigating. Every evening after finishing ranch work, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by property maps, county records, photographs, and notes. The smell of old paper and black coffee filled the room while a desk lamp cast a yellow circle of light across documents that had not been opened in years. If Patricia wanted to turn this into a paperwork battle, she had picked the wrong rancher. My grandfather kept records of everything. My father kept records of everything, and I had inherited both habits. The first breakthrough came from the county clerk's office. I requested every publicly available document related to the trail project: easements, land use agreements, access permits, development approvals, anything connected to the corridor crossing my property. 2 days later, I sat in a small records room flipping through files while an overhead fan hummed quietly above me. The deeper I looked, the stranger things became. There was no recorded easement granting public access across my ranch. There was no signed agreement authorizing trail construction. There was no compensation record, no land transfer, no legal instrument giving the homeowners association any ownership rights whatsoever. I reviewed the documents twice because I assumed I had missed something. I had not. The paperwork simply did not exist. On paper, my property remained exactly what it had always been: private ranch land. The second breakthrough came from a surveyor named Frank Delaney. Frank had spent nearly 30 years working property disputes throughout the county. He met me at sunrise near the damaged fence line carrying a tripod, measuring equipment, and enough experience to spot problems quickly. The morning air smelled like fresh earth after a light rain. We spent hours walking boundaries, checking markers, and comparing historical surveys against current conditions. By noon, Frank removed his hat, looked across the pasture, and shook his head. "Your fence was sitting exactly where it should have been," he said. "Not close." "Exactly." Then he pointed toward the walking trail. "That path crosses your property multiple times." Hearing the words spoken out loud felt strangely satisfying. Not because I wanted conflict, but because facts finally replaced assumptions. The trail was not operating in a gray area. It was operating on my land. That afternoon, I hired a drone operator to create updated aerial maps. The images were even more revealing. The photographs showed the entire route winding through portions of my ranch before reconnecting with subdivision property. Every turn, every gravel section, every access point became documented evidence. Meanwhile, the festival planning continued. New banners appeared almost daily. Social media advertisements promoted family activities and outdoor experiences. Local vendors announced participation. Patricia gave interviews celebrating community growth. The larger the event became, the more public the situation became. Then came the discovery that changed everything. During a meeting with a local attorney, we reviewed county livestock regulations and liability statutes. Most of it was standard legal language until one section caught my attention. The attorney leaned back in his chair and tapped a paragraph with his pen. Under county rules, properly marked livestock areas remained active agricultural zones regardless of nearby development. Individuals entering such areas assumed certain responsibilities when adequate warnings existed. I read the section twice, then a third time. A slow smile formed before I even realized it. For weeks, Patricia had been acting as though popularity could override property rights. She believed enough foot traffic could transform a ranch into a park. But the law did not work that way. Reality did not work that way. As the attorney continued explaining the regulations, pieces of the puzzle started fitting together. The survey maps, the missing easements, the livestock classifications, the warning requirements. Every fact pointed in the same direction. For the first time since the fence came down, I was no longer focused on what Patricia had taken. I was focused on what she had overlooked. And judging by the growing size of that upcoming festival, she had overlooked something very important. 3 days before the festival, I began putting every piece into position. Not because I wanted a confrontation, but because I wanted the facts documented so clearly that nobody could pretend they did not understand the situation later. The first thing I did was install new warning signs along every access point connected to the trail. Bright reflective lettering, easy to read from a distance. Active livestock area, private ranch property. Enter at your own discretion. I placed them exactly where county guidelines recommended. Then I photographed every sign from multiple angles and recorded the installation dates. By the end of the afternoon, the entire corridor was documented. The next step was paperwork. My attorney helped prepare formal notices explaining the property boundaries and the agricultural status of the land. Copies were delivered to the Homeowners Association office, the management company, and the event organizers. Another set was sent through certified mail. Every delivery generated a receipt. Every receipt went into a growing folder on my desk. The paper stack was becoming thick enough to resemble a small textbook. Meanwhile, the festival preparations accelerated. Every morning, new equipment arrived. Portable tents appeared near the subdivision entrance. Trucks delivered supplies. Volunteers placed directional signs throughout the neighborhood. Social media advertisements encouraged residents to invite friends and family. The excitement was impossible to miss. Even from my ranch, I could hear conversations drifting across the trail about food vendors, live music, and weekend activities. It seemed like the entire community was looking forward to the event. Patricia appeared everywhere. She posted photographs online, gave interviews, and attended planning meetings. One local newspaper even published an article calling the festival a symbol of community progress. When I saw the article, I noticed something interesting. The trail itself was featured prominently in every photograph. The same trail crossing private ranch property. The same trail lacking any recorded easement. The same trail I had repeatedly objected to. Yet nobody seemed interested in asking difficult questions. Momentum had become Patricia's greatest ally. 2 days before the festival, I received confirmation that all of my notices had been delivered. The Homeowners Association could no longer claim ignorance. The organizers could no longer claim confusion. The information existed. The warnings existed. The documentation existed. What happened next would happen with full knowledge of the facts. That evening I drove through the pasture checking gates and fence lines. The sun was dropping toward the horizon, covering the grass. In a deep golden glow. In the distance, my longhorns moved calmly across the field. Massive animals, but predictable. Well managed. Healthy. Every one of them belonged exactly where they were. Watching them graze, I felt strangely calm for the first time in weeks. The situation was no longer emotional. It was procedural. Facts had replaced frustration. Records had replaced arguments. Then my phone buzzed. A friend forwarded me a video Patricia had posted that afternoon. She stood beside the trail, smiling confidently while discussing the upcoming celebration. Near the end of the video, a reporter asked whether there had been any opposition to the project. Patricia laughed lightly. "Everything is under control," she said. "Some people resist change, but progress always moves forward." The crowd around her nodded approvingly. I watched the clip twice before setting the phone down. Progress always moves forward. The statement lingered in my mind while I looked across the pasture. What Patricia still did not understand was that progress and permission were not the same thing. Excitement and ownership were not the same thing. And popularity did not magically rewrite property lines. As darkness settled over the ranch, I finished my final inspection and closed the gate behind me. The festival would begin in 72 hours. Patricia believed she was approaching her biggest success. I knew she was approaching her biggest mistake. Festival morning arrived with clear skies and temperatures already climbing before 9 o'clock. From my porch, I could hear music carrying across the fields long before I could see the crowds. The smell of barbecue drifted through the air. Vehicle doors slammed. Children laughed. Golf carts moved back and forth through the subdivision. Willow Creek Estates looked more like a county fair than a neighborhood. By mid-morning, hundreds of people had gathered around the trail. Colorful tents lined portions of the route. Food vendors handed out samples. A local band played near a temporary stage. Everywhere I looked, people were taking photographs and posting videos. Patricia stood near the center of it all, greeting visitors like a celebrity. Arriving at her own premiere, the confidence on her face was impossible to miss. From her perspective, everything had worked exactly as planned. The trail was crowded. The event was popular. The community loved it. What she could not see was the growing stack of documentation sitting in my office. The surveys, the certified mail receipts, the legal notices, the photographs, the county records. Every piece was already in place. Around 11 o'clock, I completed one final walk along my side of the property. The warning signs remained visible. The access points remained documented. The livestock area remained exactly what it had always been, an active ranch operation. Nothing unusual had changed. In fact, that was the entire point. I was not introducing anything new. I was simply continuing to use my property the same way it had been used for decades. A little after noon, I opened a gate connecting two grazing sections that were already part of the ranch's normal rotation schedule. Beyond the gate stood 18 Texas Longhorn bulls, massive animals with impressive horns and calm temperaments. They were accustomed to moving between pastures as part of regular management routines. As the gate swung open, they began walking at their own pace across the grazing corridor. No rushing, no excitement, no chaos. Just 18 very large animals moving through land designated for livestock. The reaction from the festival crowd was immediate. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. Phones came out. People who had been casually strolling along the trail suddenly realized they were standing beside an active cattle operation. Some visitors calmly stepped back to observe from a greater distance. Others decided to continue toward different parts of the event. Parents gathered their children closer. Vendors paused to watch. Within minutes, social media filled with photographs and videos of longhorns crossing the landscape behind the festival activities. The images spread quickly because they were striking. Huge Texas cattle moving through open pasture while a suburban festival unfolded nearby. Meanwhile, Patricia looked increasingly uncomfortable. I could see her speaking with organizers, then with volunteers, then with several board members. The problem was simple. Nothing happening violated any rule. The livestock belonged there. The ranch belonged there. The grazing area belonged there. Reality had finally shown up to interrupt the marketing brochure. Then another development occurred. A county inspector arrived after receiving multiple inquiries about the event location. Shortly afterward, a sheriff's deputy arrived as well. Neither seemed interested in the cattle. Instead, they spent their time reviewing maps, examining property boundaries, and speaking with organizers. The questions became more serious as the afternoon continued. Documents were requested. Explanations were requested. Clarifications were requested. Patricia's confidence began fading with every conversation. For weeks, she had controlled the narrative. Now she was being asked to support it with facts. By late afternoon, portions of the festival were already winding down. The music continued, but the atmosphere had changed. Excitement had given way to uncertainty. People were no longer talking about community progress. They were talking about property lines. And as I watched the longhorns grazing peacefully beneath the Texas sun, I realized the most powerful part of the entire day was how ordinary it actually was. The cattle were doing exactly what cattle had always done. The only thing that had changed was that everyone could finally see the truth that had been sitting there all along. The fallout started on Monday. By Tuesday morning, the county had formally requested documentation related to the trail project. By Friday, the questions had become impossible for anyone to ignore. I spent most of that week doing the same things I had always done. Feeding cattle, repairing equipment, checking water levels. The ranch did not care about homeowners association politics. The grass kept growing. The cattle kept grazing. The sun kept rising over the same fields my family had worked for generations. But beyond the fence line, everything was changing. News of the property dispute spread quickly throughout the community. Residents who had attended the festival began asking questions of their own. Some wanted to know why the trail crossed private land. Others wanted to know whether the homeowners association had actually secured permission before promoting the project. The answers were not easy to provide because the paperwork simply was not there. A few days later, I attended a county meeting where survey maps, aerial photographs, and property records were reviewed. The atmosphere felt very different from the confidence I had seen at the clubhouse weeks earlier. Facts have a way of changing the mood in a room. Every document pointed to the same conclusion. The trail expansion had moved forward without the legal foundation required to support it. Eventually, the homeowners association agreed to remove the portions of the trail crossing my ranch. Temporary signs disappeared first. Then sections of gravel were removed. The promotional materials stopped appearing online. One morning I drove past the subdivision entrance and noticed the large banners were gone. The smiling families. The scenic trail renderings. The promises of nature access. All of it had quietly vanished. Patricia remained in her position for a short time, but the trust that once protected her had disappeared. Residents who had supported the project wanted explanations. Board meetings became crowded. Questions became direct. Within a few months, new leadership took over the association. Patricia's era of unchecked confidence ended not with some dramatic confrontation, but with accountability. In the end, that was what mattered most. Not revenge. Not embarrassment. Accountability. The county required corrective actions. The damaged fence line was restored. Property boundaries were clearly marked. Future projects faced stricter review procedures. And perhaps most importantly, people started paying attention before assuming they knew who owned what. Several months later, I stood beside a newly installed cedar post near the same stretch of pasture where this entire story began. The smell of fresh cut wood drifted through the air as I tightened the final bracket into place. Behind me, the longhorns moved peacefully through the grass. The evening sun painted the pasture gold. Everything felt familiar again. Stable. Honest. Real. I rested one hand on the fence and thought about my grandfather. I could almost hear his voice carried across the years. A fence does not keep cattle in. It keeps foolish people out. Back when I was a kid, I thought he was talking about livestock management. Standing there that evening, I finally understood what he meant. Boundaries matter. Property matters. Respect matters. And no matter how polished a presentation looks, no matter how many banners get printed, and no matter how many people applaud an idea, none of those things can change reality. The ranch was still there. The cattle were still there. The land was still there. And as the last light faded across the pasture, I looked at the completed fence stretching toward the horizon and felt something far more satisfying than victory. I felt peace.